Greetings and welcome to a Wizard's Virtual Eye on X Rebirth VR Edition, which popped up on Steam, and I thought, you know what, let's give that a try. I like VR, I like space sims, or at least I liked Frontier Elite 2 back in 1993/1995, somewhere around that region, and of course Frontier First Encounters, not to be confused with Elite Dangerous, of course, the recent sequel to those games, which came out a few years back, and a lot of people like it. For me, it never quite hit the mark. Elite Dangerous, I think, is one of those games that sounded on paper back during the Kickstarter enormously better than it actually turned out to be. I think the gameplay is pretty weak, and people bandy around terms like as wide as an ocean, as shallow as a puddle, and these are things that I tend to agree. I think the big mistake that was made with Elite Dangerous was trying to make it this online multiplayer game, whereas I think it would have really shone as a single-player experience. I think they made too many sacrifices to bring it to the online realm. But we're not talking about Elite Dangerous today, or indeed Frontier First Encounters or Frontier Elite 2. We are talking about X Rebirth, which of course is the latest game, or X Rebirth VR Edition, which of course is the latest game in the long-running X series. Not quite as long-running as the Elite series, but pretty long-running. It's one of those series that I've looked at a few times. I think I owned X2 possibly. I think I bought X3 in a sale at some point and never managed to get into it, despite a lot of people saying that that was the best game in the series and really shone, was one of the best sort of space empire building games. I suppose it's not like an empire like, ruling planets and stuff, but like an economic empire, a trade empire, if you will. You could buy all sorts of ships. You could like set them on their own AI paths, running around the place, trading for you, making loads of money, and generally being awesome. You could build stations, all that kind of good stuff. Now, X Rebirth was a kind of reimagining of that series rather than a direct sequel. It was clearly trying to focus a bit more on a console-like experience. It had a first-person mode where you could walk around in stations, you could loot containers in stations, like just open like lockers and things and take stuff out. It had a lot of very, I suppose, arcadey kind of influences in that respect. I remember at the time when it came out, I read an interview with one of the devs, and they said they were aiming for GTA in space, which I don't think they hit, but it gives you an idea of the sort of direction they were trying to take the series in. It wasn't very well received. Over the years, there have been a number of expansions which I think have brought it back more towards the original core values of the series, which generally have been much better received. Which brings us to X Rebirth VR Edition, which popped up on Steam today. Here's the intro.
I get that it's hard. Your prized possession gets stolen, stripped for parts, and thrown away like it's nothing. But it happened before, right? Think of the story of it. The Pride of Albion. One of the most advanced ships in the known galaxy. Too expensive when the jump gates shut down and everyone runs out of money. Renamed, stripped, abandoned, left to rust. You find her. You build her back up. Give her a jump drive, the best engines and shields, a whole arsenal of weapons, even Sita. Who else used time compression tech in the last 30 years? And yeah, we lost it all to some pirates. But such is the legend of the Albion skunk that we did the whole thing all over again when we got her back. So let's focus on what we can do. I'll stay back here, redo all the calibrations. You get back in that cockpit and do what you do. Trade, fight, build. Be smart. And don't you worry, Ren Otani. This ship will lead back to its former glory in no time.
Which all sounds very exciting and interesting. However, it kind of brings me to my first criticism, which is that this game is called X Rebirth VR Edition, okay? It's not called X Rebirth 2. It's not called X Rebirth the sequel, in which you get to rebuild the Albion skunk after getting it back from pirates. It's X Rebirth VR Edition. I was expecting to see the original X Rebirth campaign content in this game, but with VR added, with the ability to play through the game in VR. But that's not what it is, and I think calling it X Rebirth VR Edition is misleading in that respect. And what concerns me is just how much content there actually is in those two campaigns. Now, I haven't played through them. I kind of started the first one, the Restoration Project, which, as it's described, is basically just a tutorial on how to play the game, and not a very good tutorial, I might add. The second one, The Threat, sounds like it might have a bit more story content, but frankly, who knows? Now, I appreciate that the X games are not necessarily about the campaign content. There is a whole free play mode that you can play in. You can tool around the galaxy, you can build, you can explore, you can do all that kind of good stuff. But nonetheless, X Rebirth definitely had a fairly lengthy campaign with a lot of story content in it, which is missing from this VR edition. Now, if you'd already played that campaign, that might not be of an issue for you, but if you hadn't played the old game and you were looking forward to playing through that content in VR, then, you know, you're out of luck. So I think it's very poorly named in that respect, and also it kind of leaves me with this slightly bad taste in my mouth. If it's not X Rebirth, if it's not the same game as it was just with VR enabled because it's missing the campaign, what else is it missing? You know, do you have access to all the same systems? Do you have access to all the same stuff? Is a lot of that being taken out? What have they cut in order to make this VR edition? And I think, you know, by not being clear about that on the store page, I think they are just opening themselves up to criticism, potentially. Not an issue, perhaps, if you've played the original X Rebirth, you've loved it, you've played through it all, and you're looking for fresh content. In that respect, it's probably a good thing that there's a new campaign in here. I mean, it's one of the concerns for the likes of Steam, the likes of Skyrim VR and Fallout 4 VR, that if you've already played those games to death, which in the case of Skyrim I certainly have, you know, is it going to be, am I going to find the VR experience really adds enough to it to justify a full-price game when I already know all the story content? The answer to that, of course, will be yes, as long as they don't completely botch the VR implementation. Speaking of botching the VR implementation...
Hey, can you hear me in the cockpit? Okay, looks like the comms are working. I'm going to start the diagnostics. This shouldn't take long, just follow the instructions.
I don't appear to be in my seat. I mean, I'm in my seat in real life, but it doesn't appear to be where my seat in the cockpit is. How do I reset my view position? Okay, that moves the ship slightly weirdly. Okay, so this wasn't the greatest first impression, like, you know, loading into the game and being offset behind and slightly below where I was supposed to be, and there being no apparent way to actually reset that view position, having been told nothing about it since the game started. And I'm using motion controllers. The game says it fully supports motion controllers. It's one of the reasons, one of the things I got quite excited about, having been doing quite a lot of work myself in controlling a starship with motion controllers in my own little game. But no, first things first, I need to get into the cockpit seat, and there doesn't seem to be a way of resetting the control. In the end, I had to go in to the settings menu and remap a control onto the control pad for resetting my view position, which wasn't mapped as default onto the controller, which was crazy, but there you go. Anyway, it is an early access release, so I guess we can forgive a few little things like that, although really, let's face it, this is such a basic and important thing, being able to reset your position when you're in VR space with the tracked motion controllers, if that's what you're supposed to be supporting. But let's just be clear here, the tracked motion controller way of interacting with this game is just beyond worthless. Now, what I was imagining, what I was picturing, and what I'm implementing in my own game is the ability to physically interact with the controls in the ship. There would be a joystick in the ship, you can grab it with the track motion controller, move your hand around to move the joystick around, you can operate switches, you can press buttons, you can do all that kind of good stuff. That's not what they've done here. What they've done basically is mapped the joystick controls onto the thumb touchpad of the right hand controller, so you can move the ship around by touching the thumb pad, which is just, I mean, incredibly awkward to do, and there's like lag in it. I mean, it's worse than useless. It's completely worse than useless. I want to be able to like just grab a control here and move it around, or at least kind of Star Trek Bridge Crew style, have a touchscreen interface that I touch in order to be able to move the ship around and things like that. This is what VR is all about. It's all about presence. I should be able to like interact with the environment. I should be able to type on this keyboard, you know, and like input my commands and controls and generally feel like I'm actually in that cockpit and using the VR hand controllers as hands. Instead, what we get basically is laser pointers for interacting with some of the menus and not much else. You know, using the thumb pad on the top to control movement, using the triggers to accelerate or to fire the guns. Basically, it's just treating the hand controllers as a bunch of buttons and not really using them as hands tracked in three-dimensional space. The shooting is interesting. At least it targets the point, so at least it's using the tracked head controller there. Felt kind of unnatural to me. I'm not sure if it's something that I would get used to if I was using it more. I've seen that in one or two other VR games, and it seems on paper like a nice idea, but I like to be able to look around freely when I'm in virtual reality, and having to stop targeting where I'm targeting in order to be able to look somewhere else kind of feels awkward to me. So I wrestled with using the motion controllers in the vain hope that it might improve over time, but it's basically worthless. It's a game you have to play either with a control pad or with a joystick, I suspect. Now, fortunately, I do have an Xbox 360 pad hooked up, so I shoveled over. It looks like I'm trying to jump out the front of the cockpit, but no, I'm picking up my Xbox 360 controller, and I'm putting my little hand controllers down there, and I will control it with the 360 controller, which, to the game's credit, it does allow you to use the 360 controller at the same time as the track controllers. So, you know, if it turned out to be substantially better being able to like navigate the menus and stuff with the controllers, then, you know, you could do that and sort of pick them up. As it turns out, my desk is actually in the real world more or less exactly where this side console is, so I can put my controllers down on the side console, which, I mean, that kind of tickled me a little bit, and I thought that was quite cool. And using the control pad, it works as well as, you know, X Rebirth did using the control pad, but at this point you've kind of lost a lot of what makes VR to me. It's one of the reasons why I don't particularly spend much time playing the likes of Elite Dangerous in VR, because playing a VR game, or indeed playing driving games in VR, you know, playing a VR game for me is all about being in that environment, using my hands in that environment. And Elite Dangerous is not too bad if you've got like a hotel setup or something, which is pretty much the same as what is represented in game, but I don't. I've got a, you know, a fairly decent but old joystick, and I still have to use the keyboard for a lot of the controls, and it breaks me out of it every time I try and sort of like get immersed into it. And the same with this, you know, you're holding a rather abstract, you know, Xbox 360 controller in your hand whilst you're flying around. Yeah, it's nice. You're in VR. You can look around. You know, you feel the scale of the galaxy, or you feel the scale of the space around you, which is nice. But when I compare it to, you know, like VR experiences, proper dedicated VR experiences where I genuinely feel like I'm in that environment, it doesn't come off particularly well, unfortunately. So at this point, I'm starting to feel pretty jaded about X Rebirth, unfortunately. I am seriously starting to contemplate refunding the game. I've only had it for about an hour. My total morning playthrough was about an hour. And, you know, enough things here have disappointed or failed to inspire me that I'm starting to get a little bit kind of upset. Now, flying around this big ship, this is starting to make me think, actually, you know, maybe there is something here. Maybe, you know, you take all this other stuff aside, maybe I can get used to using the 360 controller. Maybe the aiming with my head is, you know, would be quite nice. Maybe, you know, using some of these other controls. Being in a properly deep VR game, which is something that is hard to find at the moment. I mean, at some point I'm going to start doing a video series on what we actually have available in the VR, like, gaming world, and the vast majority of it, including all the best stuff, really, are very shallow, short type experiences, which is in part due to the lack of funding available, the lack of resources, the lack of a consumer base to be able to put a lot of time and money into the game. It also seems to have become a bit of a cultural thing in VR at the moment, that, you know, a bit like this sort of, like, there's a lot of paranoia around simulation sickness, motion sickness at the moment. I think there's also this paranoia about games that require longer play sessions, that, you know, people aren't going to want to wear a VR headset, you know, and spend 45 minutes or an hour and a half in a game playing a single game like they might do on a screen, which I think will change in time. I think those are things that can be broken. I think you'll find actually as people become more familiar and more used to VR, simulation sickness will drop away for most people. Some, unfortunately, will probably find that it will always be an impediment to certain type of gaming experiences, but most people, I think, will be able to overcome it. And likewise, I think people will become comfortable with playing VR for longer sessions and things like that. It's what really excites me about Skyrim VR, Fallout 4 VR, is that these are going to be full-blooded gaming experiences, which, if Bethesda do their job properly and implement the VR control, the VR ways of interacting with their worlds, like, really well, and really make you feel like you're present in that world, I think that's going to blow the whole thing wide open. I was kind of hopeful that maybe X Rebirth was going to be that as well, but I don't think they've got the VR implementation itself right. I don't think just being able to look around in VR is enough. I think you need the track motion controller to really feel part of the world. You need to be able to get out of your seat as well and walk around the Albion Skunk. I mean, you're still basically trapped in the cockpit. Well, I say trapped. Of course, you can visit the stations, which has the incredibly immersive mechanic of going up, pressing a button whilst next to a giant floating icon in space, and suddenly appearing on the station.
This is the Albion Skunk. Requesting permission to dock.
Docking permission granted.
at which point you're free to randomly wander around, emptying containers of any valuables they might happen to contain that have been left there, presumably for passing space captains to loot on their adventures. And of course you can talk to various people there who can provide services and things, but it's nothing that you couldn't get through a simple menu interface. In fact, I'm pretty sure they even implemented all of those services into menus on the ship because they realized just how annoying and pointless it was to wander around on stations doing it.
Are you scared by them using Xenon components?
Absolutely. Aren't you?
The difference between Xenon and your usual AGI is that AGI don't have the means to reproduce.
Well, I suppose I can spare some more time.
Thrilling stuff. Once you're finished chatting to the random NPCs on the station and looting all the containers, you're free to return to your ship, at which point you can actually walk back onto it and explore the rather cramped and somewhat superfluous living quarters, it seems, as there's never any reason to come back here. I'm not even sure if you can come back. When you're ready to take off, you can activate the little door control panel here. The door opens and you teleport back into your seat. I'm pretty sure in the original game, the non-VR version of the game, it at least played a little animation of you sort of like getting into your cockpit seat, but none of that here, apparently. In VR version, you don't need that. Now, I've been pretty critical up to this point, and I should probably finish up by being a little bit more positive, if I can, about X Rebirth, because it's certainly not without its redeeming qualities. It's a very pretty game in many respects. The space environment is very nicely rendered, it's very busy and detailed, and there's an awful lot of, space infrastructure around. It's one of my complaints about Elite Dangerous is that there's just not very much in space in Elite Dangerous. You've got these big stations which pretty much you only ever see if you're arriving or leaving one, and the rest of the time you're just tooling about in empty space, or possibly landing on planets if you bought the Horizons expansion. But in X Rebirth, you've got these massive space installations. Each one can be very different from the last. They're all sort of modular, and they've got all these nooks and crannies and bits that you can slowly fly around, and you can fight enemies inside or very near the stations and all around the stations. There's lots of activity, there's lots of stuff going on in space, and it creates that sense of a really busy space environment, a really industrialized, active, living space environment. Traveling around through that space environment is at times breathtaking. I love the space gates that you go through, and this flash of white as you go through some kind of hyperspace dimension, I guess, and very quickly arrive in the destination area with no obvious loading screens or anything like that. Just flying around in free space is great when you're sort of near locations. It can be a little bit slow when you're not, although they do have these kind of like hyperspace highways or rivers or something that you can fly into that carry you around a much greater speed. I'm not quite so much of a fan of that myself. It feels a little bit gamey and sort of twisty-turny. I think it would have been nicer just to have had some kind of like hyperspeed drive that you could activate, which I believe you can actually unlock later on in the game, but such is the way. It does allow you to sort of see yourself whizzing around through the system at high speed, which I suppose some people might well enjoy. And in VR, it does look kind of cool, because you've got all this kind of like Doctor Who space warp thing going on around you. In the end, I'm a little torn. I mean, I definitely had some sort of standout moments in the hour or so I stunk into it. Flying around the station infrastructure with all of these kind of like, massive modules, which you really get a sense of the scale, of course, in VR. And that's one of the things that really sort of like probably will help this to stand out. And if you're a massive X Rebirth fan, or even just like, a moderate X series fan, and you didn't mind X Rebirth and you've got a VR headset, then you know what, this is probably going to be worth getting for you. Just having that chance to fly around and see all of this stuff in virtual reality, really like soak in the scale and feel more like you're there. I think you'll probably get a lot out of this. For everyone else, I suspect that the flaws are going to wind up outweighing those kind of like gems, those good moments in the game. I think the way in which the VR has been implemented is okay, but it's a little bit haphazard, and certainly things like, calling it motion controller, saying you've got motion controller support with the way in which they've implemented them is a joke. Not having a default way to reset the view bound when you go into it, and specifically pointing that out to the player, is a rookie mistake and a worrying sign, frankly. Even the way it mirrors the game view onto your monitor, it does it as a split screen view. It does it like showing both eyes, which is just ridiculous. I mean, it makes recording content, of course, an absolute nightmare because you've got to zoom in, you've got really low resolution, blurry image. It's one of my bugbears, I have to say. I mean, I'm probably going to do a whole video on this, possibly even multiple videos, on the correct way for developers to support content creators, video makers. Sure, it doesn't affect everyone, it doesn't affect your average end user, but it's such an easy problem to solve, and it's so greatly affects the marketability of your game, because obviously getting YouTube coverage and things of your game is going to be huge for your sales and things like that. So little mistakes like that, compounded by, I think, misrepresenting the game by calling it X Rebirth VR Edition when it is clearly a distinct and different, somewhat cut down game. In the end, it's an interesting idea. If you're a massive Space Sim fan, it might be worth checking out as an alternative to Elite Dangerous if you've got a VR headset. If you're not as particularly a Space Sim fan and you haven't played the original X Rebirth, it's probably not one to be worried about at the moment. There are better, far better, more immersive VR experiences, even accepting that a lot of those will be short and, lacking some of the depth. At the very least, we've only got to hang on for another couple of months, few months maybe, and we get Fallout 4, and then maybe just a few months more after that, and we'll get Skyrim VR. So the future looks bright, and at some point, my own little game might become available as well, which I am actually planning at the moment to support both VR and non-VR, but it is designed very much with VR in mind, and with tracked motion controllers and, all of that kind of stuff. A lot of the stuff that I've been talking about in this video, funnily enough. But of course, that will all have to wait for some future video. Until then, thanks a lot for watching, everyone. I have been Weird Wizard, and I will see you later.
Mission offer stored in ship computer database.